Welcome back. My name is Home Mai. This is part 3 of our introduction into triads. In this video, we are going to discuss triad inversions, what it means and how it is notated in music. We're going to introduce both the figured bass formula as well as lead sheet symbol notation. So, to begin, let's just quickly review what a triad is. There are 3 notes in a triad: the root, the third, and the fifth. It's going to look like this. And in this case, we're actually going to give ourselves a clef. We'll just keep it simple and do everyone's first chord they learn, which is C major. So the 3 parts of the chord, let's change the colors here. Let's make this black. And I'm going to fill this in here. This is our root, so black is our root. Third can be blue, sure. And let's make the fifth red. So the 3 parts of the chord are the root, third, and fifth. Now, inversions and chord inversions are always based on the lowest note, pitch-wise. So the lowest note in any score, in any music, is always called the bass note. So to simplify this, I'm actually going to just show you some examples here because I think this can be a confusing example for some. So let's take this 4-part hymn as an example. So if you take a look at the very first chord, I'm going to highlight the lowest note. This is the lowest note because it's lowest in pitch. So that's the bass note. This is 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 the bass note. Notice it's always the lowest note. This is the bass note. Okay? So the bass is very easy to understand. Let's think about a bass guitar or a double bass, string bass. They're always playing the lowest pitch. The thing to understand is the bass is not always the root. The bass is not always the root of the chord. So let me show you how this works. Let's take a look at this triad again, this C major triad. Let's say, for example, that instead of having the C on the bottom, let's say that I moved it. Let's say that we took this root of the chord and we moved it up here. So now the root is up here on this higher C. But let's say I kept the same position for my other notes. So now my third is still here, and my fifth is still here. What is my bass note now? Well, the bass note now is the note E. That's my bass. So if I write here bass, this is a C. The bass over here is now E. But the root has not changed. My root is still C. And it's still C here as well because it's still the same C, E, G notes. It's just in a different order. So really important to understand the difference between root and bass notes. Do not get these confused. The root of the chord can be in the bottom position, but it doesn't have to be. The bass note is always going to be the lowest note, and it may or may not be the same as the root. So now let's take a look at the final example. Let's say that I do the same thing again. I take, this time, the third of the chord. I move it up high. My root is still here. And now, the fifth of my chord is the bass note. It's the lowest note. So now the fifth of the chord, the bass note, is a G. Which makes sense because a C major triad has 3 different notes, C, E, and G. So C could be the lowest note, the bass note, E could be the bass note, or G could be the bass note, which gives us 3 different positions, or 3 different inversions. Notice the root of the chord always remains C. So you might have read a lead sheet symbol before. Let's see, I can even pull up a lead sheet symbol for you, just to give you a quick example. I'm thinking about where I can. Let me pull up a lead sheet symbol real fast. And this way you'll be able to see Heck, I can just use one of my compositions. Let's see here. Let's use, all right, let's use this here. So now, let me share the screen. All right, here we go. So this is one of my songs that I've composed. Right, so let's take a look what I have here. You'll see there's a single staff. You'll see there's words. There's a melody. Okay, but then you have these symbols on top. Capital D, which means D, lowercase m, which means minor, D minor. Then over here it says D minor / E, which is said to be D minor over E. What does that mean? That's telling us you have a D minor triad, but the bass note is an E. That means it's a D minor triad, D minor, with an E in the bass, like that. Okay. Here, this is D minor over F, D minor and an F in the bass. Okay, that's what that means. G minor, B flat major, C major, A minor, B flat major, C major. Okay. Right. So that means the bass line starts off as a D, but then goes to an E and then to an F, while the chord stays as a D minor. Like that. Okay. Let's go back to our staff paper. What that means is, this chord here, where the root is in the bass, we could write just C. Now we could write C over C, but that's kind of redundant. So if you just see C as your lead sheet symbol, this is lead sheet symbol notation here, or just referred usually as just lead sheet symbols. Sometimes it's called a chord chart. A chord chart. So, musicians have different names for the same thing. It's like, is it a pancake or a flapjack? It's the same thing. If we look at this next one here, okay, the bass note is E, so we're going to write C over E. You could write it like this. You could also write it like this, C over G. Both are acceptable. The letters are always going to be capitalized. Okay. So what this is telling us is that in this example here, you have a C major triad and a C major bass note. Here we have a C major triad and the bass note is E, the lowest note. Here we have a C major triad, the lowest note is G. That's all it's telling us. Now, this is what we call this first chord here is what we call root position. It's called root position because the root is in the bass position. The second version is what we call first inversion. It's called first inversion because we have inverted the chord once, moving the root higher, which means the bass note is now the third of the chord. And the final example is called, as you might guess, second inversion. So how can you remember this? Well, very easily. It's all about the bass. If the bass is the root, it's root position. If the bass note is the third, it's first inversion. If the bass note is the fifth, it's second inversion. Just like that. Okay? And that's actually what it means. Now I'm going to just demonstrate why this is the case, because you might be wondering, well, what about the other notes? Why don't those matter as much? Why is it all about the bass? Well, because of the song. It's all about the bass. But let's say I have a C major triad. Okay? I can do the sequence C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C, E, G. Any of these notes exist in the C major triad, which means I can do any kind of pattern. Doesn't matter. But listen to how the feeling of it changes based on the bass. So I'm going to start with the root. Here's my root, C. I can do two C's, that's an octave. Okay? But listen to how it sounds differently now if my bass note is the third of the chord, E. Feels completely different. It doesn't feel as strong as a root position C major triad. It sounds maybe a little bit more timid, maybe a little bit more pensive, a little bit more unsure, uncertain. If the root of the chord is the fifth, right? It doesn't have the same kind of uncertainty as first inversion, but it doesn't have the certainty of the one. So how could this affect music? Well, let's say, for example, I was writing a piece of music and I wanted to give it a sense of strength. Okay, maybe I'm doing Amazing Grace. Root position. Okay, gives it a nice solid feeling of strength. Let's say I want to give it a little bit more uncertainty. Okay, maybe I'll move it up higher, and instead of putting the root in the bass, I'm going to put the third. I'm changing my chords a little bit just to have fun with it. Notice how that completely changed the way the music felt. Okay, so the primary instigator of that change is the bass note. It's a tool I use a lot as a composer. I love first inversion triads. It gives us this real sense of longing. For example, I have a song which spends a lot of time on first inversion. Okay, if I did it in root position, it's just not going to have the same sense of questioning. So this is something I think is a really powerful tool to understand. And when you understand the reason for it, I think it makes it a lot more interesting too. So really powerful stuff here. And it's so simple to understand. All right, so hopefully this is making sense so far, because I'm going to show you one more thing. And this is a concept which is known as figured bass. Figured bass. And figured bass, also known as figured bass cymbals, it's the very old way of doing this. So lead sheet cymbals, this is pretty new. This is really created in the 20th century and used even pop music, jazz musicians use this, rock bands use lead sheet cymbals. Figured bass cymbals was created all the way back in the 1600s. And in fact, we have some historical use of figured bass previous of that era. But this is really a tool used in the Baroque era of music, B-A-R-O-Q-U, the Baroque era of music, the era of Bach, 1600s to 1750 or so in Western Europe. And figured bass cymbals tell us the same information, but they give us a little bit more information in addition, and they tell it to us in a slightly different way. So let me show you. We're going to take the same examples here, and to do this, I'm just going to erase all of this here, okay, just to give ourselves some room here. And I'm going to get rid of this too. We don't need this, just to make it a little cleaner and hopefully a little bit easier to understand. Still using C major as an example, but this applies to any triad at all. So now let's say, okay, that my root here is C, okay, but this time I want to analyze this by comparing the intervals between the third and the root, or the third and the bass note, and then the next highest interval 2. Okay, the fifth and the root. So in figured bass, we're always comparing the intervals of higher notes to the bass note. Higher notes to the bass note, not the root. So for example, the interval between the third and the bass note is a third. The interval between the fifth and the bass note is a fifth. So this figured bass would be 5-3. 5-3. Because we have a fifth between the top note and the bass note, and the third between the third and the bass, the middle note and the bass note. 5-3. So that means that 5-3 always refers to root position. Triad. If we look at the next example here, again, we are just comparing higher notes to the bass note, to the lowest note. So in this case, let's compare the lowest two notes, gives us a third. And now compare the highest note to the lowest note, and that gives us a sixth, because E to C is a sixth. So in this case, the figured bass is 6-3. That means 6-3 always refers to first inversion, triad. And last but not least, let's take a look at this final example here. And again, we're going to compare the bottom two notes. That's a fourth, because G to C is a fourth. And then the outer two notes, E to G, which is a sixth, which means our figured bass symbol is 6-4, which will always refer to second inversion triads. Okay, and it's very important to distinguish by the ways. So 5-3 is a root position triad, 6-3 first inversion triad, 6-4 second inversion triad. Now, musicians try to be kind of efficient. So typically, a root position triad will not have any figured bass. It could be 5-3, it could also just be a simple 5, or it could be nothing at all, which it usually is. So this would look like, usually, let's say that we were doing a Roman numeral 1 chord, it would just be a 1. But it could be 1, 5-3, it could be 1, 5. All of these represent a root position triad. They mean the same thing. Let's look at our next example here. First inversion triad. Now, we like it to be efficient, so usually it's notated as just a 6 and not a 6-3. So in this case, you could write it as a 1-6 or a 1-6-4, for example. Now, it doesn't have to be a 1 chord, it could be a 4 chord, it could be a 5 chord, it could be anything. I'm just using 1 as an example. And we'll go over Roman numeral chords in a separate video. And then second inversion, okay, we need both. So it's going to be always a 6-4. So it could be like a 1, or it could be a 4 chord, a 4-6-4. Doesn't matter. Oops, I wrote the wrong one here. I wrote a 4 instead of a 3. My apologies. So that's figured bass for you. Now here's another way of thinking of figured bass. This is the way that musicians think of figured bass. So let's say that you're dealing with C major. All right, now this is not how it would be written. It would not be written as C5-3, but let's just for the sake of simplicity of understanding, let's say that it was written that way. You have a C, just add a third and add a fifth. C major. Let's say that you had a C6-3. Okay? This time, the lowest note is going to be in, not an A, but an E. Just add a third above the bass note and then add a sixth above the bass note. So see how that works? You can take this in reverse and find the other notes. All right, so that's how musicians would quickly be able to improvise given a figured bass. Anyways, we've covered lead sheet symbols. We've introduced the concept of figured bass as it pertains to triads. So we will have videos covering seventh chords next, as well as the qualities of seventh chords and the figured bass symbols for seventh chords, as well as lead sheet notation. So I hope this video was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave a question in the comment section, and I will try to get around to addressing that. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. I hope this was helpful. Take care.